And I'd like to welcome everybody to the final event of the term in the Study of Central Europe seminar series here at UCL SSEES. And my name is Jakub Beneš. I'm a lecturer in Central European history here at the School of Slavonic and East European Studies. It is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening, Tomasz Kamusella, who is reader in modern history at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland. He's an interdisciplinary scholar, having published lots on various aspects of history, politics, philology, and has many books to his name, including Politics and the Slavic Languages, Eurasian Empires as Blueprints for Ethiopia, from ethno-linguistic nation state to multi-ethnic federation, ethnic cleansing during the Cold War, the forgotten 1989 expulsion of Turks from communist Bulgaria, and the un-Polish Poland at 1989 and the illusion of regained historical continuity from 2017. So I think those titles give you an idea of the incredibly broad range and expertise of our speaker tonight, who is presenting tonight on an extremely interesting and I think provocative comparison: Galicia and Rwanda, social or ethnic genocide. It's almost 10 past 5, so without further ado, I will mute myself and let Tomasz take over.
Thank you very much for inviting me over. It would be so much nicer to be this evening together with you in London, but we still have this blasted pandemic going on. So I'm happy that I can talk to you over Zoom using this nice technology. So, yeah, I mean, you could ask why comparing Central Europe to Africa. Many people were asking me that in the past. I would say, why not? What's stopping us? And especially what's stopping us from comparing Central Europe and different parts of the world, if such a comparison is useful, if such a comparison is sensible, if such a comparison yields some methodological and other research insights. Okay, I could draw to a degree on my biography to show you how come that I'm interested in Africa. Basically, my academic career started in South Africa in '91, when after the end of communism, I had an opportunity to read for an MA in South African literature at Potchefstroom University. And truly speaking, when I was there, many things in South Africa appeared kind of similar to me, like back home in Central Europe at that time. First of all, obviously, transition from authoritarianism to democracy. Second of all, actually, the use of different languages for building different political movements, including, in the case of South Africa under apartheid, the unrecognized ethno-linguistic nation states, so-called Bantustan. So there is some logic to what I'm doing. I've just found out these similarities by studying and doing research in these different parts of the world, and I always wanted to bring them together if it was sensible in some way. And I've been doing research in the interdisciplinary manner for a very long time, and this interdisciplinarity kind of opened me to such long distance comparisons, if I may say so. Then, something like 5 years ago, at St. Andrews, where I'm teaching, this push started, initiated by students, that they want to have more non-European, non-Western history, non-Eurocentric analysis of the past. So I decided, okay, fine, I can do it. And I started basically doing it by doing research on what I've been on the areas on which I used to focus, where I used to sojourn for some time. And as Jakub pointed out, I published such a book, actually initiated and co-wrote it, Eurasian Empires as Blueprints for Ethiopia. Until this book, not many people notice that modern Ethiopia as an ethno-national federation is very similar to what the Soviet Union used to be, or for that matter, Yugoslavia. And there is an explanation to it, because the leaders of communist Ethiopia in the 1970s actively borrowed the model from the Soviet Union. Yeah? So this small book is about the transfer of ideas of statehood from actually Central Europe via Asia to Ethiopia. And earlier in 2017, my friend from Zimbabwe, Felix Ndlovu, on kind of being nowadays an emigre in Australia, we decided to initiate and co-edit a volume on the social and political history of Southern Africa's languages, because we've noticed this analytical approach to language politics for analyzing histories of different languages in their socio-political context is applied in Europe, in the West, quite widely, but outside this area, elsewhere in the world, truly speaking, the study of languages is pretty traditional in the Eurocentric meaning of this word, and Finex and Ndlovu and I wanted, well, to give an impulse to change it. Okay. I can also say that studying the development and uses of ethno-linguistic nationalism in Central Europe, once, like, I don't know, 7-8 years ago, my student and I started discussing, okay, Central Europe is the area where you have a cluster of ethno-linguistic nation states. Do we have in the world any other area where you have such a cluster? And we actually, after some discussions, found out that there is another cluster like this in Southeast Asia. And actually, the very last map from this atlas of language politics in modern Central Europe, which went live just a couple of days ago, and on which I have been working for 12 years, the last map actually shows in the cartographic form this comparison, and probably it will be kind of a future research field into which I wish to delve. But without further ado, having explained how come I'm engaged in such kind of long distance comparisons, today I would like to talk about Rwanda, the Rwandan genocide and the Galician peasant uprising. Some people, once again, would be surprised. Why to compare these? Yeah, truly speaking, one of the peer reviewers were saying that you should not compare European history to history in other parts of the world. I just shrugged. Why not? I mean, is it a latent Eurocentrism or something? But okay, beyond this kind of bragging that it should be done because it could be done, truly speaking, The whole story started with me teaching the so-called special subject, which is a year-long course module at St. Andrews for the students of the last year of the honors path, so the fourth year students. And my special subject is on ethnic cleansing and genocide in the 20th century. And obviously, when it comes to talking about genocide in the 20th century, the Rwandan genocide is one of the best known cases which you end up discussing. And when you teach students and when you discuss these things, in order not to succumb to the horror of the events, you go to back to methodology and also reflect on definitions together with the students. So obviously, the definition of genocide as given in the 1948 Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide in Article 2 defines genocide as the destruction in whole or in part of a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. And now there is an interesting thing, yeah? From the methodological perspective. Did the genocide which happened in Rwanda in 1994 was a genocide in light of this UN definition of genocide? On the surface of it, yes, yeah? Because when you have a book about the Rwandan genocide, or when you have a study of what happened, immediately the book will tell you, in Rwanda, you have two main ethnic groups, the Tutsis and the Hutus. And because of some political problems, the Hutu-dominated government and administration decided to undertake the extermination of the Tutsis. Yeah. Sounds pretty obvious that it was a kind of genocide in light of the UN definition. However, it sounds obvious only at the level of looking at the material through the lens of literature in English and in French. Because when you start scratching the surface, especially when you start having a look at the material in Kinyarwanda, which is the language of Rwanda, it is out of sudden, it is not that obvious. Yeah? Because when we think about ethnic difference, the difference should be marked from the perspective of the Central European experience through language, through customs, through culture, through religion. Yeah? So the Poles and the Germans belong to different nations because they speak different languages. The Croats and the Serbs belong to different nations because now we know they speak different languages, or at least they use different scripts, but for sure they profess different religions. So let us have a look at the Hutus and the Tutsis in Rwanda. They speak the same language. They write the same language. They have the same religion. They have the same kind of customs. They actually are distributed all across the country. There are no villages, cities, city quarters, or regions which would be homogeneously Tutsi or homogeneously Hutu. So what is the difference? Yeah? And that was the beginning of the story. I tried to understand what kind of difference is here at play. And in order to find out what kind of difference it is, you have to go back into history, or at least as much as we can go into the past using the sources available to us. And truly speaking, what is posed here as ethnic or ethnicized difference, if I may say so, looks to my eye as social difference. Yeah? Actually, I will be talking about it in a moment, just to present the historiographic argument. But from the perspective of the UN definition of genocide, if one social group decides to of a nation decides to exterminate another social group of the same nation, in light of the UN definition of genocide, it is not a genocide. Obviously, it's a legal definition. You can disagree as a scholar, but that's how international law works. Actually, the fact that social and political groups were excluded from the UN definition of genocide is the doing of the Soviet Union, Britain, and South Africa. So obviously in the Soviet Union, social groups in the interwar period and later were exterminated, and political groups on a big scale. And Britain and South Africa were involved in the racial profiling of entire groups and kind of changing these populations so that they would suit this or that political project. Obviously, sometimes the horrible character of a genocide committed by one social group on another social group is such that, irrespective of this definition, the UN decided to recognize such an event as a genocide, and the precedent of this kind is obviously the Cambodian genocide of the latter half of the 1970s. In Cambodia, or communist Kampuchea, if you want the other name, it was Khmers, communist Khmers, killing non-communist Khmers. Yeah, so there was no ethnic difference between these two. There was political difference, or you could say social difference. But in the mid-90s, the UN, after the US agreed to actually recognize Cambodia, the Cambodian bloodbath as a genocide. Okay, but let us return to Rwanda and to this kind of modern history beginning prior to the colonial period, somewhere in the 1870s. So when I had a look at the social structure of this kind of a kingdom, which became today's Rwanda, you had Tutsis, who were kind of like Central Europe's noblemen. Yeah? They were landowners, they were administrators, they were few, they were rich, and they were lording over, if I may use such a phrase, Hutus, who were basically peasants, landless peasants or shepherds, who were working in the fields or for the herd of cattle owned by Tutsis. So they look to my eye as serfs. Yeah? And truly speaking, when you have a look at the first colonial administrators, first Germans until 1918, then Belgians, they were coming to this colony with their European or Central European preconceptions. And obviously, Tutsis or Hutus were not seeing themselves in European terms as serfs and lords, and they didn't know anything about the European system of estates or the feudal system, if you want. However, the dynamics was like this. And the perception of the colonial administrators was that these people are at the lower rank of civilization. And truly speaking, administrators were drawing back, colonial administrators were drawing back on the experience, on their own experience, Central European experience of social organization. And they were kind of reinforcing this difference. They were standardizing the difference between the socio-political, socio-economic difference between the Hutus and the Tutsis, the Tutsis nobles and the Hutu serfs. And colonial administration started issuing all kinds of legislation which was putting this dynamic relation between these two social groups in the single kingdom. It was standardizing it and putting it in stone. Yeah? That whoever is Hutu would remain Hutu forever. Whoever is Tutsi would remain Tutsi forever. Obviously, we know from anthropological research that it wasn't like this before European colonization. So, colonial administration saw it like this, and then the civilizing mission was endowed with this ideology of progress, that in order to be able to legally exploit these people, the colonizing powers must kind of ensure progress for them. And this progress was seen through the lens of these colonial Eurocentric stereotypes. So you had this kind of racialism coming from this Anglo-American colonization. So in the racialized terms, Tutsis began to be seen as quote unquote white blacks. I'm not joking. Yeah, that was the term of the times. And Hutus began to be seen as black blacks or real Negroes. Sorry for the term. It is once again the term of the sources. But racialization was not enough, because in Central Europe you had ethnicization, especially after the First World War, where you needed to explain quote unquote difference between the groups of humans in ethno-linguistic terms. So especially Belgian colonizers started defining Tutsis and Hutus as different ethnic groups. And that's a really interesting development, because it happened in the early 1930s, around 33, 34, at the same time when ethnicities known as nationalities in the Soviet Union were put in stone when every citizen of the Soviet Union was issued with this internal passport with their nationality inscribed into it. The Belgians did exactly the same in Rwanda and also in the neighboring colony and now country of Burundi. And now when they did it, they issued every person with this identity booklet, ID booklet, very similar to this ID booklets in the Soviet Union, and you were not allowed to change your ethnicity. So when you were recognized as a Hutu, or when this racialized and ethnicized Hutu identity was imposed to you, you were not allowed to change it. Even though in the past, when a poor person who was a kind of a hand, landless hand working for rich Tutsi landowners, in the past, such a poor person, if he or she, rather he, was lucky enough and gathered some capital or some property, he could become a Tutsi, yeah, because it was a social difference before it was ethnicized and racialized in the process of colonization. Now it was illegal and it wasn't to be done, and you had these ID books and records keeping these two groups apart. Obviously, the logic was colonial, divide and rule. Yeah? Also, the logic of the estate system was also following this principle of divide et impera. So that's how this initially, historically speaking, social difference between these two groups in this area or in this polity, nowadays we know it as Rwanda, was racialized and ethnicized by colonialists, by colonial administration on the model of what they knew from Central European history and they saw as an earlier stage of a development. And when they went to Africa, they were kind of imbued in this belief that Africa is an earlier stage of development and they are going there to develop, to spur on progress of these colonies. Then, when the colonization happened in a big wave after this Second World War across most of Africa and Asia, the Belgians did a very interesting thing. Basically, they gave every person in the country one vote, as in Belgium. Yeah. Before it wasn't the case. Tutsis were administrators, judges, landowners, factory managers. But when you give everyone one vote, obviously Hutus constituted the majority. So from the perspective of Rwandan history, national revolution happened. Like to a degree, you could say in the Soviet Union, a national revolution happened that landless masses took over the power and established the dictatorship of proletariat after 1917. So the Hutus became the dominant. The parties constituted the government of new Rwanda, of new independent Rwanda. It happened at the turn of the 1960s. And they basically took over this ethnicization and racialization of these previous socio-political or socio-economic groups. And these groups became, in their own eyes, from their own perspective, and also from the perspective of outside observers, ethnic groups, and the dynamics, unfortunately, because of political decisions, led to the 1994 genocide. Okay. What kind of relation does the story have to the Galician Jacquerie, the Galician, sometimes called also the Galician slaughter, in the pro-nobility narrative, I would say. And I prefer to use the more neutral term of the 1846 or Galician peasant uprising. if you are a student of Polish history, and especially if you kind of received education in Poland, as I did, you hear during your classes of history and during your classes of Polish language and literature a lot about quote unquote national uprisings of 1832, of 1864. Yeah. Obviously, what we were learning in Poland and what some historians are repeating, it is, I mean, they are kind of creating, co-creating and reproducing the Polish national master narrative, which was formulated at the turn of the 20th century and nowadays is the cornerstone of the Geschichtspolitik, the politics of history, as being taught and practiced and politically used in today's Poland. If you look at the events from the perspective of research on the phenomenon of nationalism or on the ideology of nationalism, obviously there wasn't such a thing like the Polish ethno-linguistically defined nation in the 1860s, in the middle of the 19th century. So these uprisings of 1832 and 1864, these were not uprisings of a national character. These were uprisings of the Polish-Lithuanian nobility who wanted to regain the pre-modern or early modern polity of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which was not a nation state. However, when you have this very thorough coverage of these national so-called uprisings, very little attention is being paid to this Galician peasant uprising. And truly speaking, there is very little research done. Obviously, there are a couple of books published, in German and in Polish when these events happened. Then by Kieniewicz in communist Poland, when there was this trend to do a bit of peasant studies. But until today, the topic is kind of hush-hush. Why? Because it doesn't fit this Polish national master narrative. Because who was killing who from the perspective of Polish national master narrative? Serfs, peasants, were killing noblemen. However, from the anachronistic national perspective, as it is being adopted today for the purposes of education in Poland, it was one social group of the Polish ethno-linguistic nation killing another social group of the Polish ethno-linguistic nation. And obviously, it doesn't make sense. Yeah. So how to explain it to children? So the event, this uprising, is kind of overlooked and not discussed and brushed aside in this kind of moralizing tone. Oh, it was bad. It is the sport of Cain, which we need to live with on. And no actual analysis is given of it. Yet, if you have a look at the estate system, which was the dominant kind of system of social, political and socio-economic organization in Central Europe, at least until the third quarter of the 19th century, the difference between the estate of nobility and the difference, and the difference between the serfs who were outside actually, or they were not even commoners like in Western Europe, they were outside of the estate system was huge. And noblemen, speaking Polish, living at that time, let's say in the Russian Empire, had more in common with a nobleman in Portugal than with a serf who was working on his field. So it was the social and socio-economic or socio-political difference keeping these two groups apart and making them so different, which led to this killing. But it shouldn't happen so, yeah? Because social differences, as we understand them nowadays, they happen within a nation, and members of the nation should not be killing other members of the nation to the point of extermination. And how to explain this dilemma? I would say that different customs, different speech, and even language, although the national master narrative leads us to believe that peasants and noblemen were speaking the same. Well, not really, because peasants were illiterate and noblemen were literate, and they had different socio-linguistic repertoires. That this difference can be seen as ethnic. And actually, noblemen in Poland, Lithuania, in the 17th century, developed this ideology of sarmatis. The noblemen stem from the Iranian warriors, and serfs stem from Slavic slaves, yeah, from Slavs. So there was this ethnic component present there. I chanced, like 10 years ago, upon works and research by Austrian historian of Slovenian origin, Andreas Moritz, who was doing research on Carinthia and actually on these issues of difference between peasants vis-a-vis other peasants and vis-a-vis lords. And he, in order to experience this dynamic, which I've just described in the case of Galicia, pre-modern or early modern Galicia of estates, he came to the conclusion that we cannot talk about peasants as such, as an estate only, because obviously that's how it looked like from the perspective of the ruler. But if you have a look at the socio-economic, socio-political world from the perspective of peasants themselves, we need, according to Moritz, to talk about micro-ethnic groups. He calls them Microethnosen in German, or Dorfengruppen, or Dorfethnosen. Basically, each bigger serf village, or serfs living in a parish, they constituted their own ethnic group. So, truly speaking, if you remember about this and the ethnicizing ideology of Sarmatis, you can reinterpret what happened in Galicia, in Western Galicia in 1846, as an ethnic conflict between nobles and a lot of peasant ethnic microgroups, which actually decided to come together in order to be able to defeat the ethnic group of nobles. Well, so that's my article. That's kind of main argument which I presented in my article, which got published in Nationality Studies. And you could ask, what's the point? Why to do it? First of all, the point is that we should compare more between European events and non-European events so that we could transcend this limit of Eurocentrism, which is kind of, or Westernocentrism, which is kind of blocking our view. The second point is that methodologies which we are using should not be used mechanically, that we should learn from the events, and if the events say otherwise, we should change methodologies to be able to better describe and analyze the events which happen. So, as I've just shown, something which started as a socio-economic, socio-political difference in Rwanda, in the end, through all kinds of colonial impositions, became an unusual ethnic difference, racialized ethnic difference, which is not a difference in linguistic terms or religious terms, while in Galicia, something which is commonly seen as a socio-political and socio-economic difference of different states, simplistically speaking, if you scratch the surface and you go for the self-perception of peasants and self-perceptions of nobles involved, has an important ethnic dimension which may explain the violence of what happened in Galicia. Obviously, it happened in a small area, but the violence was comparable to the violence observed in any genocidal scale events. And it allows you to interpret and analyze more insightfully what happened 150 years ago, instead of going just into this moralizing overdrive. It was bad, let's forget about it, let's continue with building our nation and sticking to the national master narrative as it is. Unfortunately, as you probably know nowadays in Poland, it is the logic of teaching history in schools. So, yeah, probably I should stop here instead of going to the latest history, which is not history yet. So thank you very much for your attention. And I'm happy to hear your questions and discuss the questions. And I hope I haven't overshot my slot too much.
Well, thank you very much, Tomek, for that very stimulating talk. And you certainly didn't run over time. You were just over 40 minutes, so we have plenty of time still for discussion and questions. I have a couple that leap to mind. I would invite anyone who has a question to use the raise your hand function, and I will call on you in the order in which the hands are raised. If your sound isn't working, you can also use the chat function to write a question, and I will read it out. But I think it's preferable if you can ask the question yourself, if the technology allows. Well, I don't see hands being raised just yet. So maybe I'll abuse my privileges as convener of the seminar to ask the first questions. First of all, I think just a comment. I think I agree with you entirely, Tomek, that we should be thinking about extra, as Europeanists, think about extra European comparisons, and the same goes for people working on the global South, that they should not feel barred from comparing their studies with European events, and I think you deserve our congratulations for doing just that in a very rigorous and interesting way here. I mean, I guess when I had a question relating to the final part of your paper when you're asking what's the point, and I guess I was wondering what's the point, sort of what's the upshot for genocide studies, because the paper title features the term genocide very, very prominently, and you start, of course, by discussing the definition of genocide. So I'm wondering if this comparison for you kind of throws up new insights about how genocide can or should be understood. So that's one question, and then the kind of follow-up question on that is I mean I think you persuasively showed that the Rwandan tragedy of the early 1990s had its root in kind of social antagonisms and social identities rather than ethnic identities. However, you do mention that, of course, the Hutus and Tutsis by the 1990s did self-perceive as ethnic groups. So it seems like in both cases, actually, there's a kind of ethnic self-perception that's quite important. So in a sense, both instances of collective mass violence, of extreme brutality in both cases, have a kind of are seen through an ethnic lens, even if they're not rooted in ethnicity. So that's a kind of comment question, I guess. Is that kind of the case? And what do you think about that?
Great. Thank you, Jakub, for the question. So, I mean, the first question, I would say that this reflection which I've presented on the ground of genocide studies allows students, researchers better understand that that the distinction between social difference and ethnic difference is not set in stone. Yeah? And that it is that these differences are scholarly constructs to allow us to analyze the past, quote unquote, in logical manner. Yeah? But sometimes the events of the past do not follow the scholarly logic. Yeah? And the scholarly logic needs to be changed or attuned to the events on the ground in order to allow us to explain what happened. Because otherwise, if we are, kind of ring-fenced to this distinction between ethnic and social difference, and then we apply the legally binding definition of genocide as adopted by the UN, there was no genocide in Cambodia. There was no genocide in Rwanda. Yeah? So that's one thing. Obviously, genocide studies is a new field developed after the Second World War. And most legal experts are very reluctant to use the term, the concept of genocide to talk about events earlier than the Holocaust. Yeah? It started changing in the 60s, 70s, when the question of the Armenian genocide appeared. And at the turn of the 21st century, it started changing when Hochschild wrote the book about King Leopold's ghosts, devoted to what at that time was Belgian Congo, where basically half of the population in the span of 30 years were exterminated. Yeah? And it was the population was not exterminated on the ethnic basis. The population was exterminated because they were not white and they should work and provide taxes. And 50% of the population, 10 million people, it didn't look to the observers and commentators as anything else but genocide. Yeah. So this led to the formulation of multiple scholarly definitions of genocide. So that's the development of that's how quote unquote development of genocide studies happens and can be held by this more nuanced understanding and application of the distinction between social and ethnic difference. And also anthropology helps us. Now I'm coming to the second leg of your comment or your question. I didn't mention it in my talk. I didn't want to go too deeply into it. Basically, events on the ground may and often do look different from the perspective of participants and onlookers. Yeah? This distinction in anthropology is marked by the signaled by the terms emic and ethic. Ethic is how outside observers are perceiving and interpreting an event. And emic perspective is the way in which people who are actors of the events perceive the events themselves. And this sometimes makes a gulf of difference, yeah? Because from the ethic perspective of outside observers, what happened in Rwanda was not a genocide because it was social groups killing one social group, killing another social group, because if you apply any widely accepted definition of ethnic groups, the Hutus vis-a-vis the Tutsis, they are not ethnic groups, they are the same ethnic group. Yeah? Yet, through the emic perspective, the perspective of observers who grew up, were socialized and educated for several generations between more or less 1890s or rather 1910s, because it took some time to instill the colonial administrative system on this region. And the 1960s, they were educated in this racialized, ethnicized terms of self-perception as imposed by colonial administration on these nominally or previously social groups. And this didn't change after gaining or regaining independence. It kind of continued until the 90s. So although Hutus and Tutsis speak the same language, have exactly the same culture, profess the same religions in plural, without going into details there, they, because of these ID booklets which were introduced in the 1930s and continued until 1994, they perceived themselves as members of different ethnic groups. Yeah. So yeah. Does it answer it? Oh, there is some comment. I don't know if in our chat.
Yes. Well, well, thank you for that, Tomasz, for that illuminating answer. I think first we should go to this question asked by Maria Ustimenko in the chat, and then I see Lucian George's hand up. But first, Maria's question: do you think this framework can be applied to the war between Armenia and Azerbaijan, switching the focus from it being an ethnic conflict to a social political one? And if so, what could be the advantages of that? I'm still a bit unclear on the why here.
Well, I would say rather not, yeah, because in the case of the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan, or between the ethnic Armenians and the ethnic Azerbaijanis, it's a very clear ethnic conflict. The Armenians and the Azeri or Azerbaijanis, they speak different languages. And they profess different religions, or they cultivate memories of different religions. So here there is no this vacillation as in the case of the Hutu-Tutsi conflict in Rwanda between social difference and ethnic difference. What we have in the case of the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan today, it is very clearly ethnic conflict, obviously exacerbated by Soviet politics of putting ethnicity in stone. Yeah? So there are similarities of this colonial imposition, but it is clearly an ethnic conflict.
Thank you. Yeah, I suppose it's kind of a conventional war as opposed to an outburst of collective or mass violence. And I don't know about the war that much, but it seems like it lacks the sort of the violence would seem to lack kind of exterminatory logic that you see in some other episodes. First Lucian, and then Tom Lorman.
Hi, thanks. That was a really interesting paper or talk. Just leading off your final remarks about the difference between emic and ethic notions of ethnicity. I guess wouldn't it be a problem in that case if we're to give primacy to the emic, to treat the Galician slaughter as an instance of ethnocide, considering that the peasants in question didn't openly recognize a notion of ethnicity. If the ethnic process which you're describing is more like an objective ethnicization, insofar as there were objective cultural differences between the peasants and the lords, and which might have been reflected in social attitudes. But if the peasants themselves hadn't been subjected to some kind of conscious racialization process, and on the lord's side, in turn, plenty of the lords of the landowners who were killed were themselves Polish nationalists whose intention was to reach out to the peasants as members of the same nation. So on the other side, also obviously there's this Sarmatian legacy, right? But there's also a lack of a kind of emic ethnic thinking on the other side. So in a sense, aren't you doing two different things and treating the Rwandan genocide as a genocide insofar as it is emically ethnic, and the Galician slaughter as ethically ethnic?
Yeah, you could draw such a distinction. Obviously, the Galician case is more complicated by the fact that nowadays we perceive the world through the quote-unquote standard of demographic difference in the shape of the nation, and political difference in the shape of the nation state. Yeah, all the states nowadays are nation states, and all the populations living in these states are nations. Yeah, but obviously the ideology of nationalism was kind of budding in the 19th century only. So looking at the situation which you started actually, which is very interesting, thank you for that, in the case of Galicia, from the perspective of this ideology, some noblemen were thinking about themselves as members of the Polish nations, as actually leaders of the Polish nation, and they were projecting their wishful thinking onto the peasants. Yeah, but the peasants had no way of knowing what the lords wanted them to be, and they had probably no wish at that time to be members of any nation. Yeah, so you had different political expectations which were completely unrealistic. And it kind of added to the violence and the bitterness after the violence of the people who happened to be in the midst of it. So that's the nature of historical processes, that we should remember that some things which we nowadays take for granted, like nations and nation states, didn't exist at a certain point. And obviously, you can fall back onto some kind of socio-political structures which then existed, like estates and serfdom, and explained in these terms, and sometimes it is done, although not very regularly and thoroughly. Only nowadays, in the span of the last 2 years, kind of innovative peasant studies taking a critical look at this, at the institution of serfdom started happening in Poland. So I during last 2 years, I bought like 5-6 monographs on that, which is really great, truly speaking. But but you can also have a look at it from this ethnic perspective, as I propose, and actually it is not a mechanic thing of imposing ethnicity as a concept in order to explain the event. You can do it through sources and through research, because Sarmatism among nobility was for real. Yeah, many noblemen believed in that as much or even more at that time than into the idea of the ethno-linguistically defined Polish nation. Yeah? They prefer to see themselves as descendants of the Iranian warriors who were ethnically and through lineage different from the serfs, who were stemming, according obviously to these noblemen, from Slavic slaves. Yeah? And this obviously leaves us with little information about peasants, because they were illiterate and little material was left. But I was really surprised by the discoveries made by Andreas Moric in his research on Carinthian peasants in the 19th century, because this research yielded this concept of ethnic micro group, yeah, and it really pretty well merges with some kind of record which we have on events. Peasants, usually from village X or from parish X, were as much distrustful of peasants from another parish and village as of their lords. That's me.
Thank you. Tom.
Tom Lorman, I guess.
Yeah. Not Tomasz. Tom Lorman. Can you hear me? Are you ready to ask your question?
Yes. Sorry about that. Technical problems on my part. Thank you, Tomasz, for a very daring and stimulating paper. I have two questions to ask. The first is that I'm a little bit shaky on the numbers here, particularly in the African case, but we're talking about in the West Galician Uprising, something around 1,000 people killed. Yeah. Whereas we're talking in the Rwandan case of over 800,000. Am I about accurate there? And while differing scales doesn't necessarily refute your comparison, but it suggests in the West Galician case, relatively localized violence with relatively localized explanations. And even if we dismiss the old canard of Austrian stirring things up, nevertheless, there's surely a range of specific local factors that are playing in here. whereas in the Rwandan case, a much broader, larger event, and in fact one of a series of events, if I know my history a little bit, is there not there? Therefore, are we not comparing really apples and pears here between something which is really a vast genocide and one which is a much more localized event? And the second question here is, vis-a-vis this split that you make between the Sarmatian nobility and the peasantry, with their own distinct sense of identity, I can see that more in the 18th, certainly back into the 17th century. It seems to me that by the 19th century, much of that is shifting. For example, much of the research on, for example, the 1830 uprising suggests significant peasant participation in that uprising. That was not merely an uprising of the nobility. And in fact, even going back into the 1790s, we see significant peasant participation, even if it's been to some extent mythologized. It nevertheless was there. And so I wonder whether this distinction here that you're making between the Sarmatian nobility and antagonistic peasantry, serfs, actually in the Polish case had already largely eroded, which perhaps explains the rather small, narrow events that took place in 1846 in West Galicia. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Tom, for this very interesting intervention. You are actually putting your finger on the very contested question, when genocide is a genocide, yeah? And obviously, how many people must be killed, quote unquote, for a genocide to be recognized as a genocide? No one knows that, yeah? But it is a very relational thing. Yeah? It depends on the international organizations making the decision, recognizing something as a genocide. Yeah? Look, in the case of Cambodia, several million people got exterminated, like 1/3 of all the Khmers, in the second half of the 1970s. But what happened got formally recognized by the UN as a genocide only in the mid-90s. Yeah? So it took 20 years. Okay, fine. Now, talking about numbers. In the case of Srebrenica, it was 8,000 people who got killed. Yeah, so this number is pretty small in comparison to the total number, let's say, of the nation of the Serbs or the nation of the Bosniaks. Yeah? However, there was an intention here, that's the argument, that's the legal argument, that there was the intention to kill every single male of the arm-bearing age in this area of Srebrenica, the so-called safe zone. Yeah? And all of them got killed. And there were 8,000 Bosniak males, and practically all of them were wiped out. Yeah? So it is not the question of numbers, but also of quote unquote percentages and of intent. Yeah, and in this county or counties, I don't remember, it was near Tarnów, I guess, in Western Galicia, practically all the lords got wiped out. Yeah, so if you use this definition, UN definition of genocide, retroactively, which legally you cannot, but for scholarly purposes and comparison, you could see it as a kind of a genocide. Yeah, I mean, is it worth doing? Well, you must be careful. Yeah, I would hate someone, going with this idea. Yes, serfdom was good because peasants, when they rebelled, they killed everyone. So it served them well. Yeah? So I don't want to go down this lane. I'm just doing it for the sake of comparisons and making listeners and readers to think about the concept which they have in their head, and remember that these concepts are a product of other people, of times, and we should be careful with them, and we should not use them automatically or mechanically, if I may say so. Talking about your other question about many peasants already participating in the 1830 uprising in so-called November uprising. Well, that's a traditional Polish view, national Polish view of what happened. Yeah. Obviously, I could immediately point out to Żeromski and his famous story, rozdziubią nas kruki and wrony, this kind of ravens would tear apart our dead bodies, if I may translate it like this. And it shows that in 1864, peasants were not interested. It wasn't their story. It was nobles killing other nobles, and peasants wanted to stay away. And truly speaking, you know, serfdom created a huge barrier between these two groups. And yeah, in 1846 there were some noblemen who wanted to promise to promise the end of serfdom to peasants if they participate in the uprising against the Austrians. But look, Tom, I promise you, I'm your friend. Give me your house, and I will build a great future for you. Would you? I guess never. So yeah, let's not be naive, I would say. On the other hand, this virtual stream of scholarly books on the institution of serfdom published in Poland during the last 2-3 years, we are talking about 10 titles. So I'm really surprised. On case studies, they show that peasants didn't feel full members of the Polish nation until the 1950s, and in some cases until the end of communism. Yeah? And these are anthropological, ethnological studies, and you know, talking from an anecdotal experience, my maternal grandparents, born at the beginning of the 20th century, living in northern Mazovia, I mean, for them, this Polish nation, all these things, this Polish nation state, it was something alien. You needed to just give them contingents of goods, okay, and be done with them so they don't bother you. Yeah, and when I, being a product of communist education, was coming to my grandparents, I was talking about some nations, and they were just shaking it. Come down. You are our grandson. We love you. Okay, fine. Be a good Catholic. Fine. That's it. And still, in the case of my grandfather, who was born in 1910, there was this memory of serfdom, this transmitted to him from the generation of his parents and grandparents, yeah, and this fear that serfdom would return, yeah. So when he was talking about the introduction of collectivization of the countryside in the early 1950s, he was talking about it in the term of serfdom, and you know, this kind of change after 1956. Okay, you can't have your small farm. Oh, it was like the end of serfdom, yeah, when I talked to him. So, but look, I'm not a specialist in that, but I really recommend these books which were published recently. They should constitute a point of reference for discussion and research in this case.
Thank you. Richard.
Hello, Tomek. As always, it's a pleasure to hear your iconoclastic approach to national sanctities. Permit me to observe that just because a certain series of events have been enshrined in a national tradition, it doesn't mean that they're necessarily false. In each and every case, it's a case we need to sort of look at the sources and establish what was actually going on. And you've already answered many of the things I was planning to ask about in terms of the sort of the plebeian or the peasant turn in a lot of Polish writing. I do wonder how much serious research is now taking place on the institution of serfdom, and how much sort of polemical journalistic stuff. In the case of Adam Leszczyński, which is actually one of the better books, he's pretty unreliable on anything before the third partition, although of course he does have important things to say about the later 19th and 20th century. Picking up on one of the things that Tom said, you mentioned, he mentioned a small number of people. Okay, you answered the question on numbers. But the key thing here is the question of a localized event with commensurately sort of local causes. Something like 90% of the casualties were in the Tarnów and Jasło districts. And the big question about 1846 is, why did it take place here? And in particular, why didn't it take place in Eastern Galicia, where in addition to a sort of a social gulf, you've also got much clearer ethnic and linguistic and religious divisions than you did in the middle, not all, but in the middle of Western Galicia. And perhaps you could respond to the response of Andrzej Nowak to a great many things relating to 1846, in which he has highlighted two local factors in the Tarnów area. One is a particular intensification of people returning from service in the Austrian army. And the other is the exceptional success in that particular area of temperance campaigns pursued by the Roman Catholic clergy, which left violence rather than alcohol as an obvious means of defusing or expressing various sort of frustrations and emotions. In other words, to what extent is it possible to generalize about this very specific set of events in parts of Galicia in 1846?
Well, I mean, Richard, thank you very much for making time, to be here. It's great to see you after Trinity, after so many years. So I'm happy to be talking to you, at least in this way. Hopefully we'll have the possibility to meet. Look, my talk was not so much about events and the mechanism of these events. My talk was more about concepts and how to use them, comparatively, and how to be aware that concepts themselves are product of scholarship. And these comparisons, they are not absolutely true, or absolutely allowing for seamless discussion about two events. However, in Europe, we have no problems to compare one peasant uprising and another peasant uprising in let's say, in Poland and in Germany, or comparing a national uprising in Hungary and national uprising in Slovakia. We are doing this, yeah? So, as I said at the beginning, I was pushed by this kind of prejudice, actually, which keeps people from comparing things from Europe and outside Europe. Yeah, and actually, I'm dealing usually in language politics. When I started using the term Creole for describing the creation of new languages in Europe through the contact of speakers of different languages, drastically different languages. In Poland, I got a lot of rapping on my knuckles. No, you don't do it because Creoles exist in colonial context. In Europe, they don't exist. Okay, fine. So I'm against this dogmatism, if I may say so. Well, you pointed out that there was no ethnic difference, between peasants and in Jasło and in Tarnów and noblemen. I'm questioning that it depends how you look at it. I can send you, that was really an eye opener when I had a look at Andreas Morich's contributions on peasants in Carinthia in the 19th century. That from the dynamics, he's coming up with this idea of this microethnic group. It was really an eye opener. Truly speaking, you could say there was ethnic difference between peasants and noblemen in Tarno and Jasło. Obviously, the ethnic difference, if you measure it in the terms of language and religion, was smaller than between peasants and serfs in Eastern Galicia. But you know what? Sometimes the smaller a difference, the bigger violence. Just think, about the Holocaust. Germans and Jews, Yiddish-speaking Jews, the difference was small. You could argue, but things happen. So it is emic perception of a given situation which drives the dynamics of events. I would say so. It doesn't matter that I don't see, as a scholar, any ethnic difference conventionally understood or defined between the Hutus and the Tutsis. It was enough for Tutsis and Hutus to see the difference themselves and act upon it for things to happen as they happen.
Well, thank you very much, Tomek. Richard, we will have to finish it soon, but go ahead.
I just wanted to express my appreciation of your sort of courage in taking on the scheme, and I accept the legitimacy of sort of comparing, hundreds of thousands of people in Africa with 1,000 or most 2,000 people in Central Europe at very different time periods. I'm all in favor of that kind of comparison. I was consciously focusing on just one rather specific aspect of your very stimulating talk, and as it's a great pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, well, this has been a terrific discussion. We're coming up to the end of our session, which I, at least personally, have to observe. I will have to leave. If you want to continue the discussion further, that's fine. Tomasz is a co-host, but I don't see any hands being raised. So let me just take this opportunity to thank everyone for being here this evening. I think this was a great event to finish the term in the Study of Central Europe seminar. I look forward to seeing many of you again next term. And most of all, thank you to our speaker, Tomasz Kamusella, for such a interesting and stimulating is the word we've said several times tonight, stimulating talk. So thank you very much, Tomasz. I'm going to try to do this hand clapping thing too, if I can. And I'm going to end the recording now.